Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me virtually for my American Heritage Study essay on the homefront workforce. I wanted to give a special thanks to the team at National Council on Public History and the National Park Service for organizing this webinar series. Now, to begin today, I'll be presenting my essay titled Production Soldiers, Diversification of the American World War II Homefront Workforce. During World War II, the absence of men leaving to the military and the increased focus on war production initiated a change in the increased diversification of the wartime labor force. The United States needed to mobilize all resources to ensure Allied victory in the war. This required that all citizens and even immigrant contract workers to support the war effort by producing the necessary goods and supplies for military use. Workers of all shades and capabilities were essential for wartime production. The US government launched mobilization campaigns that encouraged women, people of color, and people with disabilities to do their part on the home front and take up work in wartime defense industries. This is a period in time where we see the famous Rose of the Riveter become popular icons of women workers. However, this was not without limitations or restrictions. Because of Japan's allegiance and the Axis powers, Japanese Americans were forcibly removed from their homes and communities and placed in incarceration camps across the United States. Racial minorities, including African Americans and Mexican Americans, began challenging America's commitment to democracy at home and abroad. But even before direct involvement in the war, the US was already preparing for war and producing goods deemed necessary for US national defense through the Lend-Lease program that was initiated in March of 1941. Through the Lend-Lease program, ships, tanks, aircraft, and other military equipment and other materials, including things such as like flour, beans, and canned food, were sent to allies in Europe and Latin America. But despite the increase of production, defense industries were still unwilling to budge on hiring racial minorities and women. This led to African American labor leader and civil rights activist A. Philip Randolph to galvanize the African American community and its leaders to organize a protest in the nation's capital for all to see. This became known as the March on Washington movement. Of course, the United States needed to make sure that any images or rhetoric reflecting America's undemocratic character would not be aired out on the international stage for all to criticize. So, to save face and to ensure equality in employment opportunities, in June 1941, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802, banning discrimination in any war-related industry or employment based on race, creed, color, or national origin. On this slide, you'll see an original pamphlet of the March on Washington that was highly publicized. And here you kind of see them using the freedom from kind of rhetoric, free from want, free from fear, and free from Jim Crow, as a way to kind of, challenge the rhetoric that the government was using to portray this kind of democratic society that they were not living up to. As a direct result of Executive Order 8802, a government agency known as the Fair Employment Practice Committee, or the FEPC for short, was established. Their main directive was to investigate any discrimination in war-related industries. Under this government initiative, more racial minorities and women were allowed opportunities in industries and trained in specialized skill sets that were not available to them before the war. Across the nation, the FEPC oversaw African American employment in defense industries, while their agency in the Southwest tended to focus more on the Mexican American population, including African Americans. The success of FEPC efforts were limited because of local and state politics that at times superseded federal politics and power. With so much going on during the war and the states focused on other priorities, the FEPC efforts remained futile. in most places. The challenge to democracy on the home front gained more national attention when in February 1942, the Pittsburgh Courier, one of the most widely circulated Black-owned newspapers, published a letter calling out the hypocrisy of American democracy. The letter, written by African-American defense worker James G. Thompson revealed how conditions in his defense factory were discriminatory and going against the values of equality and democracy that America was claiming on the global stage. In response to mobilization efforts and the government's encouragement of Americans to sacrifice their life, sons and daughters, and resources for the benefit of the war, he ultimately asked if he should, quote, sacrifice to live half American, end quote, given the inequalities and discrimination African Americans were enduring on the home front. Thompson ultimately evoked the V for Victory slogan to characterize his call to democracy's victory abroad and victory on the home front. This famously became a campaign that characterized home front politics during World War II. On the screen, you'll see a little snippet of the article that was published by the Pittsburgh Courier. And as you see, the title written by Thompson, Should I Sacrifice to Live Half American? Suggest double V for Victory campaign against Axis powers and ugly prejudices on the home front. African Americans' steadfast determination and patriotic support, despite conditions, resulted in some gains. Between 1940 and 1946, African Americans in defense manufacturing industries increased by 135%. However, statistics for African American women only shows an increase of 59%. This is because employees preferred Black men over women, and when it came to women, they still preferred white women over Black women. As I stated in the essay, surveys taken by the United Auto Workers in April 1943 show that of the 280 auto factories that hired women, only 206 of them were willing to hire African American women. In metal foundries, only 29 of the 62 plants hired African American women. By 1945, African Americans made up 11.8% of furnace and steel mills, 11.7% of shipbuilding industries, and 25% of metal foundries. In total, African Americans in defense employment rose from 5% to 8% by the end of the war. In addition to the much publicized Double V campaign launched by African Americans, Mexican Americans in the Southwest challenged American democracy in their own ways. When World War II began, the U.S. needed to secure support from Latin America in order to protect its interests in the Western Hemisphere, including the Panama Canal. To maintain Latin America's allegiance, President Franklin Roosevelt recommitted the United States to its 1933 Good Neighbor policy that promoted and promised to provide bilateral support and foster friendly relations between the U.S. and Latin America. Through the Good Neighbor policy, the Office of Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs and the Office of War Information set on a campaign blitz to promote good neighborism. In addition to efforts in educational programs and military institutions, the Office, Good neighborism was largely advertised by commissioned art pieces. The Office of War Information's Foreign Language Division hired artist Leon Olguera to create 4 bilingual posters, one of which you see here on the screen, to be used to promote amicable and harmonious relationships between the United States and Latin America. Mexican American leaders in the Southwest took advantage of this opportunity to push for equality of Mexican Americans on the home front. Similar to African Americans, Mexican Americans had faced discrimination, inequalities, and violence because of their race, ancestry of national origin, and/or cultural differences, including language. During the war, depending on various factors, including place, skin color, and language proficiency, Mexican Americans were also discriminated when it came to hiring practices in defense industries. Mexican American civil rights leaders in the Southwest essentially built on the efforts of African Americans on the home front by ensuring the Federal Employment Practices Committee was investigating and enforcing equal opportunity employment as promised in Executive Order 8802. In fact, Mexican American educator and civil rights leader Carlos Castañeda was named the FEPC regional director in the Southwest. In his investigations, he found that employers, quote, gave the Mexican American a try, but not without the greatest reluctance and misgivings, end quote. In California, where one of the largest population of Mexican Americans resided, Mexican Americans gained more jobs in professional and highly skilled work. In Arizona, Mexican Americans were mostly concentrated in agricultural and mining work. Remember, even though mining does not seem as a job that is important during wartime, copper mines actually provided the US military with materials for bullets, artillery shells, and other supplies. In Texas, the highest concentration of Mexican Americans at nearly 1 million, they only made up 5% of the war-related industries because of labor discrimination. In the Midwest, Mexican Americans took up work in steel mills of Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and Gary. Others took up work in the aircraft industries of Missouri, Kansas, Michigan, Ohio, and Oklahoma. Work in defense industries was primarily a male-dominated employment. However, with more men needed on the front lines, women were recruited to take up this work. To help make sure that employment gaps were fulfilled by women on the home front, a women's advisory committee was created in August 1942 by the War Manpower Commission. The agency partnered with local employment services agencies to produce a campaign enticing women to work towards victory by taking up defense work. The campaign consisted of films, billboards, media, and posters, some of which have been popularized in popular culture over time. These campaigns were an ultimate success, with women's employment rate in defense industries increased by 460%. Work in these industries were not only beneficial to the United States government and military, but women were also able to earn more money than they had before, and they were able to gain job skills that would help them after the war. Part of what made the Women's Advisory Committee's campaign to recruit women for war work successful was the cultural production of the iconic female defense worker, Rosie the Riveter. Originally introduced in a song by Red Evans and John Leob in early 1943, Rosie the Riveters worked as aircraft welders, artillery inspectors, mechanics, operations assemblers, and cutters. They were essentially waiting on their partners who were fighting in the war, and instead of waiting around doing nothing, they were, quote, working for victory. In Los Angeles, the North American aviation had the highest number of African American aircraft workers, including Fanny Christina Hill, who remembers making more money than she ever had, but was also racially segregated into menial labor positions. And this was what happened with a lot of defense workers, especially racial minorities, was that even though they were allowed to work in some of these industries, they were also at the same time relegated to a lot of the menial labor positions, and at most times kind of were not able to kind of climb up the occupational ladder. Today in Richmond, California, the Rosie the Riveter World War II Homefront National Historic Park is the largest public space commemorating contributions of women workers during World War II. Established in the year 2000, its mission is preserving World War II sites and resources in Richmond. Its main attraction, however, has been Betty Reed Soskin, a World War II Rosie the Riveter pictured here, who is an integral part of the park's team and shares her wartime experiences with visitors. In San Antonio, Texas, Kelly Airfield Base contracted 22,000 civilian workers, and by the end of the war, boasted the largest aviation depot in the world. The 10,000 women workers of Kelly Airfield Base were known as Kelly Cadies, not Rosie the Riveters. They were made up of Mexican, white, and African American women who provided integral work for aircraft such as the P-51 fighter and the B-29 heavy bomber. In October 1999, Kelly Airfield Base unveiled a bronze sculpture in memorial to the Kelly Cadies. Emilia Sanchez, a Mexican-American woman from the west side of San Antonio, was selected as the Kelly Cady, whose memory would be immortalized for generations to come. This is particularly a big deal because, according to reports filed by investigations in the FEPC, Mexican Americans in Texas were especially vulnerable to exclusion and discrimination in defense industries. Juan Crow, the Mexican American equivalent to Jim Crow, was alive and well in wartime Texas. In addition to the campaigns to recruit women for defense work, the War Manpower Commission launched a campaign to encourage women to contribute to other essential civilian work such as farm work, nursing, taxi and bus driving, secretarial work, seamstress work, waitressing, meat packing, and sales. More common jobs were in childcare services that rose because of more women entering the workforce, but other employment included sawmills, or what some would call pond women. I write a little bit more about them in my essay, so you can check that out if you want a little bit more information on the pond women. What I find most interesting in this area of research is the increased demand for women in the sciences. For far too long, the focus on wartime work has centered on women workers in the defense industries. But there was also a professional sector of women workers making moves in institutional fields that were also dominated by men, including doctors, architects, geologists, meteorologists, engineers, and so forth. During the war, Harvard Medical opened its doors to women, and the demand for women chemists in the Mellon Institute of Industrial Research in Pittsburgh increased by 500% from 1941 to 1944. Other industries included the meatpacking industries in the Midwest, where many Mexican American women worked as butchers, trimmers, and packers for companies such as Armour and Morrow Wilson that produced C and K rations for the military. During World War II, a total of 3 million workers with disabilities were employed in defense industries. Workers with physical, visual, and hearing impairments became valuable workers with heightened senses and skills that were often underutilized. However, wartime labor shortages and an all-out mobilization provided opportunities for all able-bodied citizens to contribute and work for wartime needs. In fact, in the first 2 years of the war, employment rates of people with disabilities increased by 300%. In a Saturday Evening Post op-ed, Edsel Ford of the Ford Motor Company characterized workers with disabilities as production soldiers who are beneficial and of great value. He is quoted as describing their work as courageous. More specifically, the quote that you see on the screen that reads, "Courage is not a matter of age or physical condition." In the photo above in the screen, you see deaf women from the balloon and gas mask divisions display a Goodyear banner. One of the largest employers of workers with disabilities was the Detroit Ford Motor Company's River Rouge plant, who by early 1943 had employed 11,163 workers with disabilities. This made up at least 10% of their total employers. The numbers are broken down as follows. 1,208 workers were visually impaired, 111 were hearing impaired, while 268 workers had leg conditions and 354 had arm conditions. Other workers had epilepsy, spine curvatures, and organic heart ailments. During World War II and even before then, workers over the age of 40 were considered physically impaired and impeded production. With that being said, workers over 40 made up 45% of the 11,163 workers with disabilities employed at the River Rouge plant. And just to kind of throw out a little side note, Ford was already known even before the war to hire workers with disabilities because of their dexterities and other heightened senses that he found valuable. So if you visit the Ford Museum online or in person, they have digital collections. Some of the photos that you'll see before World War II are dated before World War II. I believe some of them are dated from 1927 to about 1937, and it's men and women working with disabilities, working in the River Rouge plant, which is, as this little section here shows, this was not, at least for the Ford company, it wasn't a World War II phenomenon that happened. They had already been practicing this, but the numbers increased, of course, with the ramping up of war production during World War II. Workers with visual impairments were also considered extremely valuable because of their heightened sense of touch and high dexterity. Employers actually credited their ability to use sign language as an asset that allowed them, quote, unusual speed with their fingers, end quote. Because of this, many blind men and women and other visually impaired workers were hired as government contractors to sew work products like pillowcases, sheets, aprons for army chefs, army cooks, and uniforms for the military. 54 workshops hired a total of 2,600 blind men and women, other visually impaired workers like graduates from the Lexington School for the Working in Brooklyn, produced radio, cable, and gunfire instrument boards for the U.S. military. In New York, the Lighthouse Association for the Blind hired blind men to sort through and separate 8 different sized rivets for plane factories. Employers found that workers with visual impairments were able to work more effectively because of their abilities to hone in on their sense of touch to differentiate between the rivets. And as you see on my slides here, we also have workers in Camden, New Jersey at an RCA plant who produce military radios. Similar to the visually impaired, workers with hearing impairments were considered essential workers, especially in manufacturing industries. In aircraft building and repair, work tended to produce roaring and ear-piercing noise, so employers actually preferred workers with hearing impairments. They realized that noisy environments did not bother the hearing impaired and that workers were less likely to be distracted. In 1942, Goodyear Aircraft Corporation launched a recruiting drive to hire 1,000 deaf employees. The company accommodated training, instruction with sign language interpreters, and demonstrations, allowing deaf employees to be adequately trained as machinists, scientists, researchers, and supervisors. Similarly, in Firestone, workers with hearing impairments worked as inspectors, labor operators, and senior level chemists. The Henry Kaiser shipyard was also known for hiring deaf workers Unfortunately, all good things must come to an end. And at the end of the war, employers reverted back to traditional hiring practice before the war, for the most part, abiding by customary practice. Workers who were last hired were first fired to accommodate returning men and decreasing war production. Still, radical changes had taken place in the workplace practices that eventually led to more substantial change in the workplace legislation. Executive Order 8802 influenced landmark legislation of the 1960s, including Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which expanded the prohibition of discrimination to include sex and religion. Additionally, in 1965, Executive Order 11236 established anti-discriminatory hiring practices in federal contracting positions. So one of the questions that has been previously asked about where to find, what are some resources that are available to help find or at least research on these type of topics for jurisdictions to meet the American Heritage City criteria. One of the really cool resources that I found were actually produced by the National Park Service themselves. They have a website specifically on, or a web page specifically on workers with disabilities during World War II, and they included a map that is starting to identify some of these industries and where they were located across the United States. I believe there's only 4 of them on there right now, including the River Rouge plant in factory in, or I should say the complex in Detroit, and I believe in Massachusetts as well. But, you know, if you look through my essay itself, I named some spots that are not on that map yet. And I'm pretty sure if you at least look into where these really huge manufacturing industries, or, you know, meat packing industries, steel mills, if you start to identify where they're located, that would kind of get you to start looking to see if there's any possible documentation left behind, whether it's being held by the company. Not all companies like the Ford has the resources to publicize and to create museums out of, you know, their historical records. So you know, that's the tough part, as part of as far as being a researcher, is being able to locate some of them, because over time things happen. You know, like the USO, some other fires or some of their files got were burnt down during a fire, and they got lost over time. So it's about really trying to utilize every type of resource that you can, whether it's starting off by identifying major or popular manufacturing industries that we know of, so that you can kind of hone in on that. But also remember that even there are other industries or factories that were not specifically created to produce for wartime production, or even like Goodyear and Firestone, who was able to produce tires and all the other stuff, or the Ford industry. There's other smaller local regional factories that were turned into war production industries. Like in San Antonio, we had refrigerator factories being turned into bombing factories. So it's a little tough when trying to figure out, okay, where are these industries or factories located? But I would just start again by kind of going and identifying these larger name ones, and then little by little trying to see where smaller ones or ones that were converted, at least for wartime purposes, where those were located. One of the go-to resources is always newspapers. That's it's one of my favorite things to go through, but it's also very tedious. But through newspapers, you'll see some of these job ads go up during the war. You'll see not just the advertisements, or the campaigns, right, by the War Manpower Commission, or the Office of War Information, but you're going to see a lot of highlights that communities love to do on how their community members are participating and contributing to the war effort. So that's a really great thing about newspapers, is that communities themselves are allowed to share and brag in a way what they're doing to contribute to the war effort. So I would start there as well. Like the piece on Edsel Ford is on the Saturday Evening Post. And that became a little gold mine even with this research. There are some published books as well, one on the Ford and World War II, and disability politics during World War II as well. So you'll see many different resources popping up more recently, I would say, on workers with disabilities during World War II. Of course, with women in defense factory work, you can never come short. There's tons out there that has been written about women in defense industries. Of course, there's also other communities or smaller local communities that haven't been highlighted in this narrative. So that is always welcome if you're able to do that research. But as far as trying to find women or the diversity of women within those, you have Maureen Honey, who wrote an excellent book on African American women and their part in the war. We also have Elizabeth Escobedo, who wrote From Coveralls to Zoot, who focuses on the defense workers, Mexican American defense workers in California. And there is, as far as the Rosie the Riveter or defense working industries, you won't find a shortage on that. So that makes it a little bit easier to identify. If you want to look more into the FEPC and how it really impacted workers' ability to even gain access to hiring practices, there is a couple of books published by Mexican American civil rights leaders who collected some of these kind of complaints and published them. So in there, you'll be able to see how Mexican Americans in Texas or other parts of the Southwest were being treated by employers, and writing letters to the FBC or even just the Mexican American civil rights leaders themselves to, kind of voice their concerns. So there are different resources out there. And, again, I would start by just kind of looking over the National Park Service website. They already have really great stuff on there, identifying some major players in wartime defense industries, and start by looking at those major industries, and then kind of pinpointing, what could possibly be reflected, what kind of industries are reflected in your own communities. So I think that would be about it. Thank you all for joining me today on my essay on production soldiers. Again, you can refer to my essay. I included a lot more information on there that I was not able to share in this PowerPoint or this presentation. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to the team at the National Council on Public History or the National Park Service for more questions if you have any more questions you need answered. Thank you.